I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker today, Ken Kosik, Dr. Ken Kosik. He's an internationally recognized neuroscientist and co-founder of the Learning in the Brain conference, which I know many of our faculty here at UVU have attended. Dr. Kosik received his MD degree in 1976 from the Medical College of Pennsylvania and completed a neurology residency from Tufts New England Medical Center, where he served as chief resident in 1979. From 1980 until 2005, he held various appointments at the Harvard Medical School, where he became a professor of neurology and neuroscience in 1996. In the fall of 2004, he assumed the co-directorship of the Neuroscience Research Institute and the Harriman's Chair in the Department of Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He received a Whittaker Health Sciences Award from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a Metropolitan Life Foundation Medical Award, the Derek Denny Brown Neurological Scholar Award from the American Neurological Association, the Zenith Award from the Alzheimer's Association, the Ranwell Caputo Medal from the Argentine Society of Neurochemistry, and a NASA Group Achievement Award to the NeuroLab science team. We are honored to have Dr. Kosik as our keynote presenter, and I will turn the time over to him now. Thank you.
Doris, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming here today. It's really a pleasure to talk to everyone about this topic, which is something I enjoy very, very much. It's, I think you heard that the interest here has to do with education and the arts, and of course that's will be a lot of what I would like to address and discuss throughout the day. But my background is really as a neuroscientist, and so I'm going to put one more sort of vertex in this triangle here, in which we have arts, education, and the brain. And during the course of the day, we can speak a lot about how all the limbs of this triangle might relate to each other. But for the next hour, what I'd like to, or 50 minutes, I'd like to really focus on the relationship between the arts and the brain. And hopefully both what we're learning in neuroscience and what we're learning in the arts can inform education, and we can treat that during the breakout sessions over the course of the day. So we're going to emphasize here the arts and education first, and I want to sort of open with this picture here, this problem that's present on almost all campuses throughout the country. These two realms that exist, this great gulf that divides the scientists from the humanists, those in the arts and the humanistic disciplines, are often, those buildings are located in a different part of the campus than where the sciences are, and the people don't cross over this broad gulf, and what separates them seems that the people interested in the humanities really have a certain fear of science. They might have been in high school, they never could really figure out what molarity was, or they just had a little trouble, say, memorizing the periodic table, or something came up that made them think that science was really, really difficult and fearful, which, in its more esoteric versions, it can be, but it's not that hard, and really, but there is a certain fear that surrounds it. Scientists have their own problem, which is they are often just not interested in what goes on in the humanities, and it's to their detriment, because if scientists are not aware of what we're learning in the humanities, then science itself will suffer. So, and we can break this down a little bit further here as we move toward neuroscience and look at the circles this way. You see here that there's those two smaller circles there are cognitive neuroscience, which is about the mind, how we think, and then there's molecular neuroscience, which has to do with the genes that are operating in the brain and the brain cells themselves. So in the arts and humanities, we like to pose really very big questions, you know, who we are, where we came from. In the cognitive neuroscience, we also pose very big questions about the mind and how we think. But it's in the final circle here, really. The questions in molecular neuroscience are really small questions. They're just, what's the gene that does that? What's the sequence of the gene? And so the level of the questions are quite different, but so are the level of the answers. For these really big questions, I think we have to confess that we really don't have answers for the really, really big questions. But as we go down into posing our questions in a smaller way, we can get answers. We can figure out what the genes are that make the brain work. And the question really is that if we know a lot about the smaller circles, can we build up toward the bigger circles? I don't know the answer to that, but that's what I would like to talk about today. So can these circles inform each other? And let's take a stab at it. So here's a famous painting that many of you have seen by Paul Gauguin, painted in 1897. The title of this painting is Where Do We Come From? What Are We? Where Are We Going? And those questions that are the title of this painting have been asked by artists since the dawn of art itself. These are the deep, profound questions that we think about late at night, and when we really are looking inside ourselves. And what seems to be changing a little bit is that for the first time, scientists are beginning to grapple a little bit with some of these questions from a scientific approach. No scientist would say that we're going to get answers to all these questions, but we're beginning to nibble around the edges of some of these really big questions. So I think one place to start, especially since we're interested in the arts here, is and to look at the overlap between the arts, the origination of the arts, how come the arts is so important to the human mind and to our very being, and to look at that question from the point of view of where do we come from, the first question. Because somewhere in our evolutionary history, this artistic instinct has emerged. So we know that if the anthropologists have taught us that as we search throughout the globe, mainly in the continent of Africa, but other places as well, we can see a lot of skulls that have been dug up that look a lot like us. They're our ancestors, and they have their skulls are a little smaller than ours for the most part, especially down here in some of our earliest ancestors. But gradually over time, the brain has enlarged, and it's only recently that skulls have been found that are indeed us. Only in the last 100,000 years. We're really just a blink of the eye in terms of the time that life and even what are called hominids have existed on the planet. These earliest skulls go back 8 million years, and there's been this trajectory toward us and we've only emerged in the last 100,000 years. And what does that mean that Homo sapiens has emerged? What exactly has emerged? Well, what began to happen about 100,000 years ago is that our ancestors began to migrate out of Africa. What stimulated that migration? I mean, maybe what stimulated that migration was something that's just really, I think, essential to the arts itself, that it's curiosity, essential to education. You know, I always think that the kids that are going to do the best are those that are curious. And there's got to be something that motivated people who were more or less comfortable living somewhere in Ethiopia to suddenly begin this arduous trek out of Africa and face all kinds of difficulties to do what? To go to some other place. And what their motivations were is something that must be linked to the emergence of the human brain, I think. And here's something else that happened, and here we really do get to the arts. We really don't see in the remains of all these other skulls around that our ancestors, whether it's Neanderthals or what are called Homo erectus or Australopithecine, all these different hominids that existed for millions of years, we don't see anything like we see in this slide. That is, around 50,000 years ago, our ancestors began to do something else that no human-like creature ever did before, which was to go into caves and start to paint on the walls images of the animals that were in their world. And I don't know if anybody's ever had a chance to visit some of these caves in France where there's no electricity then. You know, you have to go deep into these caves. You have to be carrying a fire to keep it illuminated. And then in this deep trek, then they would paint these pictures on the wall, and who would see them? It can't be very many people that would ever even see them. There's this there's this artistic instinct that we have that is in some ways almost independent of who's going to see it. We almost have to create as a species. Also around that time, we begin to see musical instruments right here. And something else happened too here is that humans began to bury the dead. We became, and in this case, buried with jewelry. We became aware that life can end. And in some sort of acknowledgement of our consciousness about the finiteness of life, we began to bury the dead. So, and that means to me that there was also the emergence of abstraction. I mean, death is an abstract concept. And so that part of what happened in the human mind is the emergence of abstraction. Now, what exactly happened in that period, 100,000 or 50,000 years ago? What you're looking at here is a piece of the human genome. You know, the human genome has now been sequenced. It was completely sequenced in the year 2001. We have these letters that make up our genome. There are 3 billion of them. We know them all. And the individual letters here are a little different in one person from one person and the other. About the difference between your genome and the person next to you is about 1% of these letters. That say about the same number that are in red here. Unless the person next to you is your twin, in which your genomes will be identical, then our genomes are all just a little bit different. These small differences are what the forensic people use to identify the individual at the crime scene, for instance, these small differences between people. But the vast majority of these letters, what makes up the genome, is really the same among us all. And we would like to think that maybe something at the level of the genes might have changed 50,000 years ago that stimulated what today has become culture and our ability to abstract and all of these things that happened that make our species so remarkable. Now, as I said, we weren't the only human-like creatures to inhabit the planet. This is a guess at what a Neanderthal might have looked like based on its skeleton, which has been found over here. And here is Homo sapiens, that's us, that's Neanderthal. Their skulls were as big as ours, their brains were as big as ours. They had, we now know, Actually, believe it or not, just in the last year or two, some bones were found from a Neanderthal in a cave, and we were able, when I say we, not me, but scientists were able to get enough DNA to actually even sequence the Neanderthal genome. And they are remarkably similar to us. But they didn't do what we do. There was a period of time where Neanderthals and humans lived side by side. We know that from remains in the caves. Neanderthals became extinct, humans flourished. And part of that might be due to these very small differences in the genes. So, and it turns out that it wasn't just Neanderthals that were on the earth at the time, but there were other creatures just like us, like recently discovered in a cave in Siberia were the Denisovans, another Neanderthal-like creature that also walked the earth. And all of these creatures, all of our closest relatives have gone extinct, except for humans. In fact, even our closest relatives that remain on the planet, like chimps and gorillas and orangutans, are also being threatened now with extinction. So humans have done remarkable things in terms of our cultures, and we've jeopardized the existence of many of our closest relatives. So here is actually now, we also have the genome of chimpanzees, and of course chimpanzees are less similar to us in terms of their whole genomic structure, but they're about 97% like our genes. They are our closest living relatives. And so since we can't really study Neanderthals, we can try to study chimpanzees and try to understand exactly what traits they have and what they lack that allowed for the emergence of the human mind. So here is something I would now like to show you, something that happened in Utah that is really something that only humans do. And I'm going to see if this can work here. Let me see if I can get this running. Here it is. You'll recognize this, I'm sure. Who remembers this event? It was relatively recent. Yeah, okay, a lot of people. Now, this, as you know, look at this car hit that motorcycle, and you saw that woman there. She pointed underneath because she knew the driver of the motorcycle was under the car. And spontaneously, all these people came together, lifted that car, dragged the guy out after she had pointed him out. I think he did survive. And to me, it's remarkable that that kind of spontaneous human cooperation. You would never see that in a chimp. In fact, here's just the individual shots from that. You would never if a couple of chimps had to try to move a big log, you couldn't even imagine two of them getting together and carrying each end of it together. I mean, that kind of social behavior, that kind of cooperation that you see here now in the individual shots from that event in Logan, Utah, just doesn't happen among any of our closest relatives, any of them that we know about. So this is what we might call the social brain. And it's a very, very big feature of being human, the social brain. Our ability to both work together and to know a lot about what we're all thinking and what has to be done. How all the people came together and everybody in that event after that accident had a role. They all aligned themselves in the right place. The woman pointed out where the guy was lying. They all came together, they lifted up, and people just assumed their roles. And they did it, and they did it effectively. They got it done. There was no planning, there was nothing. So let's talk about the elements of the social brain. Well, one of them has been discussed by Oliver Sacks when he talked about this condition called prosopagnosium. I think most people know this book. Who knows this book? The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. A few people. Basically, what prosopagnosia means is the inability to recognize someone else's face. The reason that's the first step in the social brain, because when you look at somebody else, do you know who they are or not? It takes place in just less than a second. Somebody walks into the room and you recognize them, then you know it's your wife or your friend or whoever, and then everything proceeds from there. You calibrate your interaction with the person because you know who they are. If they're a complete stranger, you have a few things you want to figure out before you start talking to them. And if a person has prosopagnosia, they have lost the ability to recognize another person's face. It can happen if a person has a stroke in a certain part of the brain, and people just lose that ability. So there's the case in this book by Oliver Sacks was a man had a stroke. He was no longer able to recognize his own wife, but once she started talking, he could recognize her because he recognized her voice. In fact, when he was in the hospital, he knew she was coming to visit him because she had a very distinctive gait. As she walked down the corridor, he recognized her walk. So he knew she was coming into the room, but if he only had the face to look at, he just couldn't do it. He couldn't recognize her face or anyone else's. So facial recognition is one area in the brain that is, and there's a part of the brain that's devoted just to recognizing faces. It's that important. When you see somebody, you put that, as I said, that information together instantly. You don't go up to the person and measure the distance between their eyes and their cheeks and everything, and then you say, oh, look at the numbers, it must be Johnny. You actually, what you do is you just know who it is from really very minimal information, because the bottom line is that we all look a lot like each other. So now there's also a condition that's emerging in which people can be born with the inability to recognize faces. This is the first condition that was actually discovered through the web, in which some people started to realize that they weren't recognizing faces. This woman has what might be called developmental prosopagnosia. She sees other faces like that. She sees their body and knows that's a field. She has vision, but she doesn't get the features of the face. And there's a site you can go to if you're worried that you may have a little bit of inability to recognize faces. You can go to faceblind.org and test yourself for that ability. Now, after you recognize the person, what do you do next? Well, now you're going to start talking to the person, and you're going to have to sort of figure out what this conversation's all about. I mean, is this a threatening conversation? Is this a friendly conversation? What's going on? And our brain spends an enormous amount of energy doing that. And so there are huge parts of the brain that are devoted just entirely to watching the eye movements of the person you're talking to. Just watching their eye movements, their gaze, so that whether the person is looking right at you, for instance, direct eye contact is very intense. It can be very threatening, or it can be very romantic, depending on the setting and who you're interacting with. But whether it's threatening or romantic, it's always emotional. Direct contact is activating parts of the brain that are related to the limbic system, or the emotional part of the brain. On the other hand, when you're talking to somebody and you watch their eyes and they move away for a moment, they avert their gaze, they leave your face and they look somewhere else, then you're thinking, oh, I better track that person's eye movements and look in the same direction that person is looking in, because it just could be that the person is looking away because maybe they became aware of some danger. Like, I just happened to look up at the exit sign and I see walking through that door an enormous elephant. And, maybe the people in the back row want to check that out. So I think that, so we really have to, we track each other's gaze a lot. And this flat area is a flattening of the human brain. Here's the human brain. And you can see here that these yellow areas, some of them pretty large, are all devoted to watching other people's eye movements. Remember, the brain is a very expensive organ. It weighs only 3 pounds, but it uses something like 20% of our energy is devoted to sustaining the brain. So when anything goes on in the brain, it's very expensive. And therefore, watching people's gaze must be important. Watching facial expressions, also, we get an enormous amount of information about each other in the social brain by watching facial expressions. And indeed, Paul Ekman, maybe you know about this, has actually coded every possible facial expression. He's identified every movement of the face, every muscle in the face, and how it can move in combination with other muscles, and has defined all the different movements that the face can be capable of, and he believes that he can detect people's emotions and thoughts by carefully looking at their facial movements. This was his work. There's a TV show that's based on his work. What is? Maybe you must know it. It's Lie to Me, right? So this system is actually still controversial as to how well it works. But these micro movements on people's faces are very, very useful for our ability to detect what other people are thinking. We really, to be social human beings, we have to know a certain amount of what other people are thinking that we're interacting with. If we know nothing, we're just aloof and oblivious and begin to exist on something like an autism spectrum disorder. If we know too much, that's also bad. I mean, if you know too much of what the other person's thinking, it's an intrusion. And so there's this right place where people want to be, but it's not a precise place. There's a lot of variation. Some people are better at it than others. And we use the word intuition, the ability of people to really intuit what other people are thinking. And the way they do that is they might not even be aware of it. In a subconscious way, they may just have the ability to detect these micro movements that go by very, very rapidly. So now I'll introduce that next slide in a second here. Some people who have gone to Learning in the Brain Conference have heard me talk about a few of these items before. Another feature that clearly distinguishes us, not just the social brain, but that distinguishes us from many of our closest ancestors, is language. And language, of course, has been a key part of the arts. It's been a key part of what we do as humans. No one really knows if Neanderthals had language, but to the best of our ability, we know that chimps do not. You can teach chimps a lot of words, and they can move things around. You can say identify can you please move the red glass over and put it next to the parrot? They can do a lot of that stuff. But what they don't have is syntax. They really can't organize things in terms of past tense and present tense and subordinate clauses and really organize language in a complex way that we do. So I want to show you another contribution of neuroscience to this ability to really understand language in a deep way. And it's a very, very clever experiment. What was done here was to take advantage of certain words that are that you have to know the meaning of to know how to pronounce it, like pint and mint. You would think they would rhyme. They look like it should be pint and mint, or pint and mint, but it's not. You have to know the meaning of the words to actually distinguish between pint and mint. So if I give you another word that rhymes, so suppose I give you the word F-I-N-T. What's the correct pronunciation of F-I-N-T? Is it fint or fint? We don't know. That's the right answer. We don't know because it's not a word. It doesn't have a meaning. Sometimes when I ask people this, they say, it's fint. I say, how do you know it's fint? They say, I know it's fint. It's got to be fint. It can't, but it's neither. It's just, whoever said that is absolutely right. It's not a word. You have to know the meaning of the word to know how to pronounce it. This is particularly a feature in English. So what they did was they gave some non-words like F-I-N-T to English speakers and Italian speakers. Now, as you know, in Italian, the words are pronounced just exactly like they look. Kids learn to read when they're, after 2 weeks of school, they already learn how to read because they just look at the words, they know the letters, and they pronounce the words. They may not be getting all the meanings, of course, and of course, in Italian, kids can also have difficulties in getting meaning, but to actually say the words comes much more quickly in Italian because the orthography corresponds to the pronunciation. The spelling corresponds to the pronunciation. Not so in English. We have these really crazy words like gnarled that begin with a G. Why? So, so what they did was they put they took Italian speakers and English speakers and put them into the fMRI, the brain imaging device, and they read them these words, these non-words, and they looked at where the brain activated, and and there were different areas in the Italians and English. Here they are. And the English speakers, these two areas activated, and the Italians, this area activated. Now we know about these two areas. These are known areas related to both to language areas. They've been known for a long time. So when you hear a word and you put meaning on it, it's not surprising that these two areas activated. But what is that? That area where what are the Italians doing when they're listening to non-words that sound like Italian words? And it turns out that this part of the brain is actually very much involved in music. And therefore, and we know that in Italian, what's called the prosody of the language, the music of the language, the intonation of the language, is perhaps more important than it is in English. Italian has this flow to it, this musicality, and part of that musicality is used to convey meaning. We have intonation too in English, of course, but we don't rely on the intonation as much to convey meaning as is done in Italian. So a large part of the meaning of these non-words was the Italians were attempting to extract by trying to get at the intonation, activating this part of the brain. And this is the way the actual studies look like. Here's the brain, here's the activation areas that happened in these subjects. So now let's talk about another aspect of being human, and this is something now we're going to talk about learning and memory. So learning and memory is obviously something that's not uniquely human. I mean, this is something that goes back, even all animals understand, have some sense of learning and memory, even snails. So you touch the snail on the antenna one time and it withdraws, the second time it withdraws a little more slowly, the third time it doesn't care anymore. It's really learned that the touch is not harmful. And we can really manipulate memory a lot in these animals. For instance, here's a fly that through genetic manipulation has developed a photographic memory. Now some of you might say, well, if there were a fly that came into this auditorium, how would you know that it had a photographic memory or not? And so here's how it happened, that there are techniques in which you can introduce genes, and we know a lot of genes involved in memory. So one of these genes was introduced actually into these fly embryos, and they grew up and they were now tested. And here's how the test goes. You put the flies into a T-tube. That means it's this glass tube, and they're put in at the bottom. They fly up, and then they can go to the right or the left. And there's one smell on this side and one smell on that side. But if they go to the right, not only do they go toward one particular smell, but they also get a shock. And over here, they don't get any shock. So what happens is you put them in a few times, and most flies will go up, and they go to the right or the left. They go to the right, they get a shock. And they might go to the right a couple times before they learn that they better not go there. They should always go to the left. It takes a few times to learn that. But the flies with this gene, they would go one time. They would make a mistake, and thereafter they would learn to go to the left all the time. And they would remember that for maybe about a week, which is a long time for a fly. So this... and I should say also that similar experiments have been done in mice. There was a mouse that a number of years ago got on the cover of Time magazine called the Smart Mouse. It was made by a guy named Joe Chen at Princeton. He called it Doogie. And it also had these choices. It can go through a maze, and it could try to find some food. And after just going through the maze one time, it remembered where the food was. And I think that these experiments were broadly misinterpreted, because what this sense of calling the mouse smart is really, I don't think it's really what we mean by being smart. What the mouse is really doing, I would say a more accurate description would be that the mouse is jumping to conclusions. It has one experience, and then it just does that all the time. That's not what learning's all about. Learning is really about making a few mistakes. And after making a few mistakes, then you know what the right answer is, so then you get it right. If we can set learning genetically so easily, why hasn't that already happened by evolution? You would think that if we could have one experience and then learn something perfectly, that would have already happened. It doesn't take much to do this genetic manipulation that I'm talking about. But our learning curve is set in a way in which we have to make a few mistakes so that we don't come to the wrong conclusion. Because what looks right the first time is not always what's right. And therefore, I think learning must have this little bit of looseness to it so that we can ultimately get to the right answer. Now let's try to move more to humans than animals here. And it wasn't until the 1900s that we even learned where memory resides in the brain. And it was this individual that until he died in 2008, he was only known as HM. He had... when he was young, he had a lot of seizures. His seizures could not be controlled, so he ended up having surgery. And to control his seizures, the surgeons removed a part of the brain on both sides called the hippocampus. A memory part of the brain was taken out to control his seizures. And but at that time, they didn't know what that part of the brain did. But after that hippocampus was removed, he completely lost all his memory. And he had been studied intensively, and it was the first person who taught us where in the brain memory enters and begins to actually get encoded. Here it is. Here's this hippocampus. You can actually record signals from it. And when you actually try to stimulate the cells in the hippocampus, this is a neuron here, and you get this reaction. These little structures on the brain, these are the synapses. This is one part of a brain cell, just a part of a brain cell. These structures begin to grow. As we learn things, the brain physically changes. That these little structures, these protrusions along the branch of the nerve that hold the synapses actually enlarge with learning. And you can see that experimentally. And here we even know the chemicals that are produced during stimulation. You don't have to worry about their actual names, but these chemicals a lot of them are known, and the genes here that encode all these receptors and chemicals are what were used to make that photographic memory fly in the smart mouse. So, what is inside our head? Well, here's Joe, and here's Joe is sitting in his room, and he's just thinking about his memories. He's just going through his storehouse, his file cabinet, his internal computer, and just dredging through a few of his thoughts. Well, what are they? Let's look at what Joe's thinking about. Even if I work 365 days a year for 1,000,000 years and never spend a penny, I'll still never be able to afford a non-crap apartment in New York. Des Moines is the capital of Iowa. If A equals B, B equals C, then A equals C. The reason H never loved me was because I was too short. This is, when we're just on our own and we're just rambling through our thoughts, they're often like this. They're sort of a little tedious. They go, and we're trying often to dredge up stuff we've learned, like the capital of Iowa. We're just, going through memories of maybe our love life. And these memories just come up. We don't seek them actively. They just come up, and they move around. Very, very fluid, just moving around in the brain, all of this stuff. This is the way actually memory looks. on sort of a day-to-day, moment-by-moment basis. And in fact, it's so much a part of us that Oscar Wilde said, most people are other people. Their thoughts are someone else's opinion, their life a mimicry, their passion a quotation. Well, that's a little cynical, perhaps. You know, we'd like to think that we are individuals, and I'm sure that's true. But, you know, Oscar Wilde, when I saw a quote from Oscar Wilde on this screen, too, and before the lecture, you know, it's really a lot of what we like to say is stuff we've heard said already. So let's go back and think about memory from the ancient Greeks. Here's what Socrates said about memory, and this is actually, he knew better. This is a tongue-in-cheek description of what he challenged his students to think about memory. Let us then say that this is the gift of memory, the mother of the muses, and that whenever we wish to remember anything we see or hear or think of in our own minds, we hold this wax under the perceptions and thoughts and imprint them upon it. That's the key sentence. You know, basically what he's saying is that memory is imprinted on the wax. They didn't have cameras then, they didn't have computers or iPhone pictures. They just basically, if they wanted to take, their analogy to the camera was imprinting something on a piece of wax. So if we were saying this today, we would say, oh, is our memory just a photograph of things? Are we just going through the video of all of our experience when we go through memory? And he's saying that, he's asking his students, do you think that's what memory really is? And, but he knew better. In fact, the Greeks knew much better than that. Because the person, their name for memory was Mnemosyne. The goddess of memory was Mnemosyne, and look who Mnemosyne was. She was the daughter of Uranus and Gaia. She slept with Zeus on 9 consecutive nights and gave birth to the 9 muses. I guess things worked a little differently then, but at any rate, it's interesting that the Greeks linked memory to the muses, to the arts. What a remarkable thing to put that together. And these offspring of Mnemosyne are listed right here. Here they are, all these different gods for poetry and music and tragedy, dance. It's all right here. So why would the Greeks associate memory with artistic inspiration? Well, let's look at that more closely. Here's a medieval view of memory. Memory was put not in the hippocampus by the medieval people, it was put in the back of the brain. And if you wanted to try to remember something, you would do what the thinker does. You would put your head down, and now the memories would flow from the back of the brain to the front of the brain. And then as soon as the flow of the memory came to the front of the brain, you would have this aha moment. Your head would go back now, and that would now give you the insight. You got the memory forward in the brain, and now you had the insight. This is what was the medieval explanation for memory. But the Greeks might have been a little bit more on target, because it turns out memory is not about the past. It is really about the future. Memory is mental time travel. So, oh, whoops, I forgot to. I had given this lecture actually in South America recently. So this says here that the role of memory is not necessarily to remember the past, but it allows us to imagine the future. So so this is really an interesting idea, because I think the only people that really, if the memory's role is to really think about the future, not to think so much about the past, then there's no necessity for memory to actually be 100% accurate. Accuracy is not necessarily a part of memory. In fact, the only people that think that memory is 100% accurate are lawyers, who take you into the court and say, what did you do on May 15th, in the morning of May 15th? It's, who remembers that stuff? It's just, memory is fragmented and not always accurate, and the reason for that is that most of what we have to do is forget. You know, what color socks did you wear 2 weeks ago? What did you have for breakfast 3 days ago? It's really, you know, most of what we're doing is forgetting. And we only remember the stuff that we have to remember that's going to help us with the future. And and many writers, we're talking about the arts here, many writers have been ahead of the neuroscientists in having this insight. Not just the Greeks, but let's read from Marcel Proust's Swann's Way. And so it is with our own past. It is a labor and vain attempt to recapture it. All the efforts of our intellect must prove futile. The past is hidden somewhere outside the realm, beyond the reach of intellect, in some material object, in the sensation that material object will give us, which we do not suspect. And as for that object, this object that you're trying to remember, it depends on chance, whether we come upon it or not, before we ourselves must die. What he means here is that, you know how you might, Proust wrote about this a lot. He wrote about a phenomenon that we all have, is that odors, smells bring up memories very often. So you might go into a restaurant or a kitchen, and suddenly you smell something, and you suddenly remember something about some really nice warm bread being baked in your grandma's home, 20 years ago or something. And and what he's saying here is that not only is memory connected in this way, but if you hadn't gone into that restaurant and had that exposure to that smell, you would have lost that memory. That part of our access to memory is dependent on our chance interactions that we have in our day-to-day life. Now, memory can go away in Alzheimer's disease and other conditions, and what we suffer when people get Alzheimer's disease, what they suffer is not just the loss of their past, but their actually inability to imagine the future as well. And if you talk to a patient with Alzheimer's disease, you can see that not only do they have trouble remembering what happened before, but if you say to them, what would you like to do on vacation this summer? They won't be able to provide the kind of detail that we can, because you remember you had a wonderful time when you went to the beach somewhere, and they don't remember that anymore. So they're not going to be able to say, oh, I want to go to the beach and I want to hope that the waves are high and I hope that there's going to be nice warm sand to put my feet in, and all the details that come from our ability to imagine the future. So, memory plays tricks on us when we look back. We talked about that. Memory is not accurate. And imagination plays tricks on us when we look forward. So, let's now talk about daydreaming a little bit, because this is a little bit of where our inspiration and our thoughts come from. I just want to ask a quick question. How are we doing on time? Should I end at like 10 or 10:15? I think, can I? 10:15, good, okay. So, so let's talk about daydreaming. And so, as I mentioned before, the brain is a very expensive organ. And you might think that when you're just sort of vegging out and you're not doing much, you're not really watching TV, or you're not reading a book, or you're not eating, you're just sitting there and not doing much, that you're not doing any task, that maybe now the brain is actually a little less active. That's not true. What happens is that the brain shifts when you're doing something that's non-task oriented, something that is, you're not trying to achieve a goal, and you're not running as fast as you can to beat the fastest time you ever ran a 50-yard dash. You're actually now in a different state. And that state also uses a lot of energy. It's different parts of the brain activate. Back here, what's called the parietal lobe. When you're in this sort of daydreaming state, it's another part of the brain that gets turned on. And all these task-driven parts of the brain, like speaking, like, being sure you're saying the right words and being conscious of the other person's eye movements and all that other stuff goes away. You're not trying to accomplish anything. You're just doing something else. And this is called the dark energy of the brain. We're at rest, but the brain is still active. What's going on in these states? They're very interesting states, and I think they're states that have a lot to do with artistic inspiration. Here's an example. This is a painting by Salvador Dali, La Persistencia de la Memoria. Here is the persistence of memory. Here is just what is happening. He's depicted here. When he was painting this, obviously he was task-oriented, but he's trying to depict that kind of state that comes when we're not actually oriented toward some task, some goal. So let me just introduce that poem first. I'm going to read it to you in a second. We're talking about the arts, and I want to go now to a poem that I think is really, really good at rendering that state, that daydreaming state of the mind. And so I'm going to read it to you here. It's lying in a hammock at William Duffy's farm in Pine Island, Minnesota. It's by James Wright. Over my head, I see the bronze butterfly, asleep on the black trunk, blowing like a leaf in green shadow. Down the ravine behind the empty house, the cowbells follow one another into the distance of the afternoon. To my right, in a field of sunlight between two pines, the droppings of last year's horses blaze up into golden stones. I lean back as the evening darkens and comes on. A chicken hawk floats over, looking for home. I have wasted my life. Now, if you spend your life daydreaming, of course, you're going to come to a conclusion like this. But this is what the arts are all about. It's not science. There's always double, triple meanings to these things. If you haven't accomplished anything that you can actually put on your CV, but you have had an experience like this, have you wasted your life? I think many people would say no, that there is something here that actually was very valuable. And it's a remarkable poem too, because he's not just looking at things that are just in a cliche manner beautiful. He's talking about horse droppings. He's there, he's just lying on his hammock and he's looking around. He's in that state that I'm talking about. So, what does the brain do? Let's now, in the last few slides here, let's just come to a couple sort of general ideas here. So, I think if we have to sum up everything I've talked about, what the brain does is it tells our own story. It kind of creates an autobiography for us. It places us in the lead role of our own story. It creates a continuity of consciousness upon a fragmented field of memories. That is, even though we have all these memory fragments, when we think back, there's continuity in our life. It's a remarkable thing about memory and consciousness, about that there is both the fragmented memories and the continuity that is just, the mind is like time travel. In one moment, you go back to when you were 10, and then you jump forward to when you're 35. It's all over the place. Deludes us about our past by conflating memory with imagination. Puts emotional valence on experience so we can learn to survive. So in the last couple slides, let's go into these ideas about creating our story a little more deeply. The brain tells our story. And of course, there's a long tradition of storytellers here, and not just in these pictures, but storytelling is a large part of what our family and our culture and our traditions are all about. In fact, let me just, I'm sorry, just to go ahead here. There's a couple slides are out of order. I want to go to this slide. So one thing with regard to storytelling is that we have to explain sometimes. Part of what storytelling is all about is we have a need to explain what we don't understand. And there are neurological conditions, actually, where people try to explain things they don't understand. It's called confabulations, the formation of false memories, perceptions, or beliefs that result from neurological or psychological dysfunction. It's a confusion of imagination and memory. But it's not just a neurological dysfunction. We all do it. We long to understand things. And the way we do that is through storytelling. We have stories that we've told in our traditions, shown here. And these kinds of stories, whether they come from religion or even from, they can come not just from religion, they can even come from science. It's not that science is immune to storytelling. So when you ask a physicist, what's your best explanation for the origin of the universe? They come up with string theory, which is just as, as sort of hard to test and understand as any of these other theories. And so it's, storytelling is a lot of what we just do as we chip away at a scientific understanding of things. We don't get to always to those really big questions. And yet, regardless of our background, whether you're a physicist or anyone else, the story becomes a part of what we need to do. So let's sort of now talk about how we put this together and put some of these stories together, and now in a more detailed way. I'm not talking about the big stories now, stories like the origin of life. I'm talking about just our day-to-day stories in which we see something and then we elaborate on it. So here's some brain imaging. This is the visual part of the brain, the occipital, the back of the brain, the occipital part of the brain. And if you ask the person just to close their eyes and they're not seeing anything, you can see that there's not very much activity in this occipital part of the brain. Then you show them a white spot, and it begins to activate. They're looking at the color white. Now, you show them this complex scene, like a painting by Cezanne or Picasso. And even more of this visual area now begins to activate. They're really putting this all together now. So here's a painting by Cezanne, 4 paintings, in which he's now painting this village where he lived for many years. And look at all the different renditions of how he painted this. It's the same place. If you did this with a camera, it would look exactly the same all the time. But he's elaborated on this in terms of what his visual cortex is doing by painting it in with these this abstract look. Here you can see the building structure. Here you can hardly see it at all, and you get it's just different levels of abstraction. The shading looks a little different. It's just it's the same place, but his mind put a different kind of look to this identical place. And doing so gave a very different feeling, because a feeling is a big part of what we're doing when we look at something. So now I'm going to show you another picture. So this is a mobile home. It's a mobile home that holds the land speed record. And so we're all looking at it, and you see something red here, and after you look at it for a few nanoseconds, that's the cab of this vehicle. You see something black and round here, and after a few nanoseconds, you call it a tire. And pretty soon you put it all together, and you say, oh, it does look a little bit like a mobile home, but it's pretty weird. And now we know it holds the land speed record, so you sort of know why it has all this other stuff on it. And so we gradually, so this is what the visual system does. It takes it all apart. It takes it apart in terms of the color, the shape. It takes things apart, and then it reassembles them. And when it reassembles them, it doesn't do it with like a photograph. It does it now by putting emotion and meaning into what we're now looking at. It's no longer necessarily as accurate as a photograph. It has all of the story behind it, the land speed record, all this other stuff, So, so now I'm going to show you something really remarkable. Here is some writing in Braille. And this, so the person here is now getting a message by reading, just like we would read a book. We would begin to visualize what we're reading. Well, here this person is reading in Braille, and instead of seeing the words, the person is feeling the words. The information is coming in through touch. But when the person's reading Braille, if they have, if they've been blind since birth or shortly after birth, the part of the brain that activates through this touch stimulus is also the back of the brain, the visual cortex. What are they, quote unquote, seeing in this enormous visual cortex through the input of touch when there's never been the experience of, say, seeing the color blue the way we know it, or any of the other myriad of visual things to which we put something very concrete on? Clearly, touch and reading a book is as meaningful for a person who's blind as for anyone who's not. And yet, and the same part of the brain is activating. So what is going on? The meaning of this for me is that indeed the brain, what the real function of the brain is telling the story. The actual color of blue, looking like blue, is much less important than putting all the other stuff that we put on visual images. And in that vein, I'd like to close with this picture. So this is a picture. This is actually a picture taken in Buenos Aires. It's not very attractive. You can see there's this graffiti, "Te amo," I love you. But it's really, the water is sort of muddy and still. The pier here doesn't have a lot of activity. It's pretty abandoned. The stone is chipped away. There's nothing very attractive about this picture. And yet, if you were the person that was standing right here in 1994 and you wrote these words on the wall, this rather tedious, boring image would be full of life and meaning and memories for you. So that the same image is going to be very, very different depending on your experience. Thank you.